It cost Charles much to give up Dosts after living there 4 years and, when he was beginning to get on there, yet if it must be, he took her to Rouen to see his old master. It was a nervous complaint, change of air was needed. After looking about him on this side and on that, Charles learned that, in the new Château arrondissement there was a considerable market town, called Villeurbanne, whose doctor, a Polish refugee, had decamped a week before. Then he wrote to the chemist of the place to ask the number of the population, the distance from the nearest doctor, what his predecessor had made a year, and so forth, and the answer being satisfactory, he made up his mind to move towards the spring, if Emma's health did not improve. One day when, in view of her departure, she was tidying a drawer, something pricked her finger. It was a wire of her wedding bouquet. The orange blossoms were yellow with just a silver-bordered satin ribbons frayed at the edges. She threw it into the fire. It flared up more quickly than dry straw. Then it was, like a red bush in the cinders, slowly devoured. She watched it burn. The little pasteboard berries burst, the wire twisted, the gold lace melted, and the shriveled paper corollas, fluttering like black butterflies at the back of the stove, at last flew up the chimney. When they left Josts at the month of March, Madame Bovary was pregnant. Part 2. Chapter 1. Villeurbanne, so called from an old Capuchin abbey of which not even the ruins remain, is a market town 24 miles from Rouen, between the Abbeville and Bovary roads, at the foot of a valley, watered by the Rioil, a little river that runs into the Indre after turning 3 water mills near its mouth, where there are a few trout that the lads amuse themselves by fishing for on Sundays. We leave the hill road at Le Boissier and keep straight on to the top of the Lou Hill. Once the valley is seen, the river that runs through it makes of it, as it were, 2 regions with distinct physiognomies. All on the left is pasture land, all of the right arable. The meadow stretches under a bulge of low hills to join at the back with the pasture land of the Bray country, while on the eastern side, the plain, gently rising, broadens out, showing as far as I can follow its blond cornfields. The water, flowing by the grass, divides with a white line the color of the roads and of the plains, and the country is like a great unfolded mantle, with a green velvet cape bordered with a fringe of silver. Before us, on the verge of the horizon, lie the oaks of the forest of Argyle, with the steeps of the St. Jean hills scarred from top to bottom with red irregular lines. They are rain tracks, and these brick domes standing out in narrow streaks against the grey color of the mountain are due to the quantity of iron springs that flow beyond in the neighboring country. Here we are on the confines of Normandy, Picardy, and the Ile-de-France, a bastard land whose language is without accent and its landscape is without character. It is there that they make the worst Neufchâtel cheeses of all the arrondissement, and, on the other hand, farming is costly because so much manure is needed to erect this friable soil full of sand and flints. Up to 1835 there was no practicable road for getting to Yonville, but about this time a cross road was made which joins that of Abbeville to that of Amiens, and is occasionally used by the Rouen wagoners on their way to Flanders. Villeurbanne has remained stationary in spite of its new outlet. Instead of improving the soil, they persist in keeping up the pasture lands, however depreciated they may be in value, and the lazy burrow, growing away from the plain, has naturally spread riverwards. It is seen from afar sprawling along the banks like a cowherd shaking a sister by the waterside. At the foot of the hill beyond the bridge begins a roadway, planted with young aspens, that leads in a straight line to the first houses in the place. These, fenced in by hedges, are in the middle of courtyards, full of straggling buildings, wine presses, guard sheds and distilleries, scattered under thick trees, with ladders, poles, or seats hung onto the branches. The thatched roofs, like fur caps drawn over eyes, reach down over about a third of the low windows, whose coarse convex glasses have knots in the middle like the bottoms of bottles. Against the plaster wall diagonally crossed by black joists and the carpentry. Sometimes lions and the ground floors have at their door a small swing gate to keep out the cheeks that come pilfering crumbs of bread, steeped in cider on the threshold. But the courtyards grow narrower, the houses closer together, and the fences disappear. A bundle of fern swings under a window from the end of a broomstick. There is a blacksmith's forge and then a wheelwright's, with 2 or 3 new carts. Outside the barley block the way. Then across an open space appears a white house beyond a grass mound ornamented by a cupid, his finger on his lips. 2 brass vases are at each end of a flight of steps. Scutcheon's asterisk blaze upon the door. It is the notary's house and the finest in the place. Asterisk the panonceaux that have to be hung over the doors of notaries. The church is on the other side of the street, 20 paces farther down, at the entrance of the square. The little cemetery that surrounds it, closed in by a wall breast high, is so full of graves that the old stones, level with the ground, form a continuous pavement on which the grass of itself has marked out regular green squares. The church was rebuilt during the last years of the reign of Charles X. The wooden roof is beginning to rot from the top, and here and there has black hollows in its blue color. Over the door where the organ should be is a loft for the men, with a spiral staircase that reverberates under their wooden shoes. The daylight coming through the plain glass windows falls obliquely upon the pews ranged along the walls, which are adorned here and there with a straw mat bearing beneath it the words in large letters, Mr. So-and-so's pew. Farther on, at a spot where the building narrows, the confessional forms a pendant to a statuette of the Virgin, clothed in a satin robe, coiffed with a tall veil sprinkled with silver stars, and with red cheeks, like an idol of the Sandwich Islands, and, finally, a copy of the Holy Family, presented by the Minister of the Interior, overlooking the high altar between 4 candlesticks, closes in the perspective. The choir stalls, of deal wood, have been left unpainted. The market, that is to say, a tiled roof supported by some 20 posts, occupies of itself about half the public square of Yonville. The town hall, constructed from the designs of a Paris architect, is a sort of Greek temple that forms the corner next to the chemist's shop. On the ground floor are 3 Ionic columns, and on the first floor a semicircular gallery, while the dome that crowns it is occupied by a Gallic cock, resting 1 foot upon the chart, and holding in the other the scales of justice. But that which most attracts the eyes opposite the Lion d'Or in the chemist's shop of Monsieur Hamaille. In the evening especially its argand lamp is lit up, and the red and green jars that embellish his shop front throw far across the street their 2 streams of color. Then across them, as if in Bengal lights, is seen the shadow of the chemist, leaning over his desk. His house from top to bottom is placarded with inscriptions written in large hand, round hand, printed hand. Vichy, Seltzer, Barrage waters, blood purifiers, raspailpate and medicine, Arabian racahoot, Darcet lozenges, regno paste, trusses, baths, hygienic chocolate, etc. And the signboard, which takes up all the breadth of the shop, bears in gold letters, Hamaille, chemist. In it, the back of the shop, behind the great scales fixed to the counter, the word laboratory appears on a scroll above a glass door, which about halfway up once more repeats Hamaille in gold letters on a black ground. Beyond this there is nothing to see at Yonville. The street, the only one, a gunshot in length and flanked by a few shops on either side, stops short at the turn of the high road. If it is left on the right hand and the foot of the St. Jean Hills followed, the cemetery is soon reached. At the time of the cholera, in order to enlarge this a piece of wall was pulled down and 3 acres of land by its side purchased, but all. The new portion is almost tenantless. The tombs, as heretofore, continue to crowd together towards the gate. The keeper, who is at once gravediger and church beadle, thus making a double profit out of the parish corpses, has taken advantage of the unused plot of ground to plant potatoes there. From year to year, however, his small field grows smaller, and when there is an epidemic, he does not know whether to rejoice at the deaths or regret the burials. "You live on the dead, Mr. Boudoy," the curé at last said to him one day. This grim remark made him reflect. It checked him for some time, but to this day he carries on the cultivation of his little tubers, and even maintains stoutly that they grow naturally. Since the events about to be narrated, nothing in fact has changed. At Yonville, the tricolor flag still swings at the top of the church steeple, the 2 chintz streamers still flutter in the wind from the linen drapers. The chemist's fetuses, like lumps of white amadou, rot more and more in their turbid alcohol, and above the big door of the old golden lion, faded by rain, still shows passers-by its poodle mane. On the evening when the Bovarys were to arrive at Yonville, widow Lefrancois, the landlady of this inn, was so very busy that she sweated great drops as she moved her saucepans. Tomorrow was market day. The meat had to be cut beforehand, the fowls drawn, the soup and coffee made. Moreover, she had the boarders' meal to see to, and that of the doctor, his wife, and their servant. The billiard room was echoing with bursts of laughter. 3 millers in a small parlor were calling for brandy. The wood was blazing, the brazen pan was hissing, and on the long kitchen table, amid the quarters of mutton, rose piles of plates that rattled with the shaking of the block on which spinach was being chopped. From the poultry yard was heard the screaming of the fowls whom the servant was chasing in order to wring their necks. A man slightly marked with smallpox and green leather slippers, and wearing a velvet cap with a gold tassel, was warming his back at the chimney. His face expressed nothing but self-satisfaction, and he appeared to take life as calmly as the goldfinch suspended over his head. In its wicker cage, this was the chemist. "Artemis!" shouted the landlady. "Chop some wood, fill the water bottles, bring some brandy, look sharp. If only I knew what dessert to offer the guests you are expecting. Good heavens! Those furniture movers are beginning their racket in the billiard room again, and their van has been left before the front door. The Hirondelle might run into it when it draws up. Call polite and tell him to put it up. Only think, Monsieur Himai, that since morning they have had about 15 games, and drunk 8 jars of cider. Why, they'll tear my cloth for me," she went on, looking at them from a distance, her strainer in her hand. "That wouldn't be much of a loss," replied Monsieur Himai. "You would buy another." "Another billiard table," exclaimed the widow. "Since that one is coming to pieces, Madame Lefrancois, I tell you again, you are doing yourself harm, much harm. And besides, players now want narrow pockets and heavy cues. Hazards aren't played now, everything is changed. One must keep pace with the times. Just look at Tellier." The hostess reddened with vexation. The chemist went on. "You may say what you like, his table is better than yours, and if one were to think, for example, of getting up a patriotic bull for Poland or the sufferers from the lion's floods It isn't beggars like him that'll frighten us," interrupted the landlady, shrugging her fat shoulders. Come, Monsieur Himai, as long as the Lion d'Or single quote exists, people will come to it. We've feathered our nest, while one of these days you'll find the Café Français closed, with a big placard on the shutters. Change my billiard table," she went on, speaking to herself. "The table that comes in so handy for folding the washing, and on which, in the hunting season, I have slept 6 visitors. But that dawdler, Hubert, doesn't come. Are you waiting for him for your gentleman's dinner? Wait for him. And what about Monsieur Bnet? As the clock strikes 6 you'll see him come in, for he hasn't his equal under the sun for punctuality. He must always have his seat in the small parlor. He'd rather die than dine anywhere else. And so squeamish as he is, and so particular about the cider. Not like Monsieur Léon, he sometimes comes at 7, or even half past, and he doesn't so much as look at what he eats. Such a nice young man. Never speaks a rough word. Well, you see, there's a great difference between an educated man and an old carabinier who is now a tax collector. 6 o'clock struck. Nick came in. He wore a blue frock coat falling in a straight line round his thin body, and his leather cap, with its lappets knotted over the top of his head with string, showed under the turned-up peak a bald forehead, flattened by the constant wearing of a helmet. He wore a black cloth waistcoat, a hair collar, grey trousers, and all the year round, well-blacked boots, that had 2 parallel swellings due to the sticking out of his big toes. Not a hair stood out from the regular line of fair whiskers, which, encircling his jaws, framed, after the fashion of a garden border, his long, wan face, whose eyes were small and the nose hooked. Clever at all games of cards, a good hunter, and riding a fine hand, he had at home a lathe, and amused himself by turning napkin rings, with which he filled up his house, with the jealousy of an artist and the egotism of a bourgeois. He went to the small parlor, but the 3 millers had to be got out first, and during the whole time necessary for laying the cloth, Bennett remained silent in his place near the stove. Then he shut the door and took off his cap in his usual way. "It isn't with saying civil things that he'd wear out his tongue," said the chemist, as soon as he was along with the landlady. "He never talks more," she replied. "Last week 2 travelers in the cloth line were here, such clever chaps who told such jokes in the evening, that I fairly cried with laughing, and he stood there like a dabfish and never said a word." "Yes," observed the chemist. "No imagination, no sallies, nothing that makes the society man." "Yet they say he has parts," objected the landlady. "Parts," replied Monsieur Humai. "He parts. In his own line it is possible," he added in a calmer tone. And he went on that a merchant, who has large connections, a jurisconsult, a doctor, a chemist, should be thus absent-minded, that they should become whimsical or even peevish. I can understand such cases are cited in history. But at least it is because they are thinking of something. Myself, for example, how often has it happened to me to look on the bureau for my pen to write a label, and to find, after all, that I had put it behind my ear. Madame Lefrancois just then went to the door to see if the Hirondelle were not coming. She started. A man dressed in black suddenly came into the kitchen. By the last gleam of the twilight one could see that his face was rubicund and his form athletic. "What can I do for you, Monsieur le Curé?" asked the landlady, as she reached down from the chimney one of the copper candlesticks placed with their candles in a row. "Will you take something? A thimbleful of cassis asterisk. A glass of wine. Asterisk blackcurrant liqueur." The priest declined very politely. He had come for his umbrella, that he had forgotten the other day at the Ernemont convent, and after asking Madame Lefrancois to have it sent to him at the presbytery in the evening, he left for the church, from which the Inglis was ringing. When the chemist no longer heard the noise of his boots along the square, he thought the priest's behavior just now very unbecoming. This refusal to take any refreshment seemed to him the most odious hypocrisy, All priests stippled on the sly, and were trying to bring back the days of the tithe. The landlady took up the defense of her curie. Besides, he could double up 4 men like you over his knee. Last year, he helped our people to bring in the straw. He carried as many as 6 trusses at once. He is so strong. Bravo, said a chemist. Now just send your daughters to confess to you. Fellows with such a temperament. If I were the government, I'd have the priests bled once a month. Yes, Madame Lefrancois, every month. Good phlebotomy, in the interests of the police and morals. Be quiet, Monsieur Hamai. You are an infidel, you've no religion. The chemist answered. I have a religion, my religion, and I even have more than all these others with their mummeries and their juggling. I adore God, on the contrary. I believe in the Supreme Being, in a Creator, whatever He may be. I care little who has placed us here below to fulfill our duties as citizens and fathers of families, but I don't need to go to church to kiss silver plates and fatten out of my pocket a lot of good-for-nothings who live better than we do. For one can know Him as well in a wood, and a field, or even contemplating the eternal vault like the ancients. My God. Mine is the God of Socrates, of Franklin, of Voltaire, and of Beranger. I am for the profession of faith, of the Savoyard vicar, and the immortal principles of single quote 89. And I can't admit of an old boy of a God who takes walks in his garden with a cane in his hand, who lodges his friends in the belly of whales, dies, uttering a cry, and rises again at the end of 3 days, things absurd in themselves, and completely opposed, moreover, to all physical laws, which prove to us, by the way, that priests have always wallowed in turpid ignorance, in which they would fain engulf the people with them. He ceased, looking round for an audience, for in his bubbling over, the chemist had for a moment fancied himself in the midst of the town council. But the landlady no longer heeded him. She was listening to a distant rolling. One could distinguish the noise of a carriage mingled with the clattering of loose horseshoes that beat against the ground, and at last the Hirondelle stopped at the door. It was a yellow box on 2 large wheels that, reaching to the tilt, prevented travelers from seeing the road and dirtied their shoulders. The small panes of the narrow windows rattled in their sashes when the coach was closed, and retained here and there patches of mud amid the old layers of dust that not even storms of rain had altogether washed away. It was drawn by 3 horses, the first a leader, and when it came downhill its bottom jolted against the ground. Some of the inhabitants of Yonville came out into the square. They all spoke at once, asking for news, for explanations, for hampers. Hebert did not know whom to answer. It was he who did the errands of the place. In town, he went to the shops and brought back rolls of leather for the shoemaker, old iron for the farrier, a barrel of herrings for his mistress, caps from the milliners, locks from the hairdressers, and all along the road on his return journey he distributed his parcels, which he threw, standing upright on his seat and shouting at the top of his voice over the enclosures of the yards. An accident had delayed him. Madame Bovary's greyhound had run across the field. They had whistled for him a quarter of an hour. Hebert had even gone back 1.5 miles expecting every moment to catch sight of her, but it had been necessary to go on. Emma had wept, grown angry. She had accused Charles of this misfortune. Monsieur Leroux, a draper, who happened to be in the coach with her, had tried to console her by a number of examples of lost dogs, recognizing their masters at the end of long years. One, he said, had been told of, who had come back to Paris from Constantinople. Another had gone 150 miles in a straight line and swum 4 rivers, and his own father had possessed a poodle which, after 12 years of absence, had all of a sudden jumped on his back in the street, as he was going to dine in town. Chapter 2. Emma got out first, then Félicite, Monsieur Leroux and a nurse, and they had to wake up Charles in his corner where he had slept soundly since night set in. He introduced himself, he offered his homages to Madame and his respects to Monsieur, said he was charmed to have been able to render them some slight service, and added with a cordial air that he had ventured to invite himself, his wife being away. When Madame Bovary was in the kitchen she went up to the chimney. With the tips of her fingers she caught her dress at the knee, and, having thus pulled it up to her ankle, held out her foot in its black boot to the fire above the revolving leg of mutton. The flame lit up the whole of her, penetrating with a crude light the woof of her gowns, the fan pores of her fair skin and even her eyelids, which she blinked now and again. A great red glow passed over her with the blowing of the wind through the half-open door. On the other side of the chimney a young man with fair hair watched her silently. As he was a good deal bored at Yonville, where he was a clerk at the notaries, Monsieur Guillaumin, Monsieur Leon Dupuis, it was he who was the second habitué of the Lion d'Or, frequently put back his dinner hour in hope that some traveler might come to the inn with whom he could chat in the evening. On the days when his work was done early, he had, for want of something else to do, to come punctually and endure from soup to cheese a tete-a-tete with Annette. It was therefore with delight that he accepted the landlady's suggestion that he should dine in company with the newcomers, and they passed into the large parlor, where Madame Lefrancois, for the purpose of showing off, had had the table laid for four. Him I asked to be allowed to keep on his skullcap, for fear of Clarissa, then, turning to his neighbor Madame is no doubt a little fatigued, one gets jolted so abominably in our hirondelle. That is true, replied Emma, but moving about always amuses me. I like change of place. It is so tedious, sighed the clerk, to be always riveted to the same places. If you were like me, said Charles, constantly obliged to be in the saddle, But Leon went on, addressing himself to Madame Bovary, nothing, it seems to me, is more pleasant when one can, he added. Moreover, said the druggist, the practice of medicine is not very hard work in our part of the world, for the state of our roads allows us the use of gigs, and generally, as the farmers are prosperous, they pay pretty well. We have, medically speaking, besides the ordinary cases of enteritis, bronchitis, bilious affections, etc., now and then a few intermittent fevers at harvest time, but on the whole, little of a serious nature, nothing special to note, unless it be a great deal of scrofula, due, no doubt, to the deplorable hygienic conditions of our peasant dwellings. You will find many prejudices to combat, Monsieur Bovary, much obstinacy of routine, with which all the efforts of your science will daily come into collision, for people still have recourse to novenas, to relics, to the priest, rather than come straight to the doctor or the chemist. The climate, however, is not, truth to tell, bad, and we even have a few nonagenarians in our parish. The thermometer, I have made some observations, falls in winter to 4 degrees centigrade at the outside, which gives us 24 degrees Reaumur as the maximum, or otherwise 54 degrees Fahrenheit English scale, not more. And, as a matter of fact, we are sheltered from the north winds by the forest of Argyle on the one side, from the west winds by the St. Jean range on the other, and this heat, moreover, which, on account of the aqueous vapors given off by the river and the considerable number of cattle in the fields, which, as you know, exhale much ammonia, that is to say, nitrogen, hydrogen and oxygen, no, nitrogen and hydrogen alone, and which sucking up into itself the humus from the ground, mixing together all those different emanations, unites them into a stack, so to say, and combining with the electricity diffused through the atmosphere when there is any might in the long run, as in tropical countries, engender insalubrious miasmata. This heat, I say, finds itself perfectly tempered on the side whence it comes, or rather whence it should come. That is true, say, the southern side, by the southeastern winds, which, having cooled themselves passing over the Seine, reach us sometimes all at once like breezes from Russia. At any rate, you have some walks in the neighborhood, continued Madame Bovary, speaking to the young man. Oh, very few, he answered. There is a place they call a patcher, on the top of the hill, on the edge of the forest. Sometimes on Sundays, I go and stay there with a book, watching the sunset. I think there is nothing so admirable as sunsets, she resumed, but especially by the side of the sea. Oh, I adore the sea, said Monsieur Léon. And then, does it not seem to you, continued Madame Bovary, that the mind travels more freely on this limitless expanse, the contemplation of which elevates the soul, gives ideas of the infinite, the ideal? It is the same with mountainous landscapes, continued Léon. A cousin of mine who traveled in Switzerland last year told me that one could not picture to oneself the poetry of the lakes, the charm of the waterfalls, the gigantic effect of the glaciers. One sees pines of incredible size across torrents, cottages suspended over precipices, and 1,000 feet below one, whole valleys when the clouds open. Such spectacles must stir to enthusiasm, incline to prayer, to ecstasy, and I no longer marvel at that celebrated musician who, the better to inspire his imagination, was in the habit of playing the piano before some imposing sight. You play? She asked. No, but I am very fond of music, he replied. Don't you listen to him, Madame Bovary, interrupted Humai, bending over his plate. That's sheer modesty. Why, my dear fellow, the other day in your room you were singing L'Ange Gardien ravishingly. I heard you from the laboratory. You gave it like an actor. Léon, in fact, lodged at the chemist's, where he had a small room on the second floor, overlooking the place. He blushed at the compliment of his landlord, who had already turned to the doctor, and was enumerating to him, one after the other, all the principal inhabitants of Yonville. He was telling anecdotes, giving information. The fortune of the notary was not known exactly, and there was the Tuvach household, who made a good deal of show. Emma continued, and what music do you prefer? Oh, German music, that which makes you dream. Have you been to the opera? Not yet, but I shall go next year, when I am living at Paris to finish reading for the bar. As I had the honor of putting it to your husband, said the chemist, with regard to this poor Janota who has run away, you will find yourself, thanks to his extravagance, in the possession of one of the most comfortable houses of Yonville. Its greatest convenience for a doctor is a door giving on the walk, where one can go in and out unseen. Moreover, it contains everything that is agreeable in a household: a laundry, kitchen with offices, sitting room, fruit room, and so on. He was a gay dog, who didn't care what he spent. At the end of the garden, by the side of the water, he had an arbor built just for the purpose of drinking beer in summer, and if Madame is fond of gardening she will be able dash. My wife doesn't care about it, said Charles, although she has been advised to take exercise. She prefers always sitting in her room, reading. Like me, replied Léon. And indeed, what is better than to sit by one's fireside in the evening with a book, while the wind beats against the window and the lamp is burning? What indeed? She said, fixing her large black eyes wide open upon him. One thinks of nothing, he continued. The hours slip by motionless. We traverse countries we fancy we see, and your thought, blending with The fiction, playing with the details, follows the outline of the adventures. It mingles with the characters, and it seems as if it were yourself palpitating beneath their costumes. That is true. That is true, she said. Has it ever happened to you, Leon went on, to come across some vague idea of one's own in a book, some dim image that comes back to you from afar and as the complete just expression of your own slightest sentiment? I have experienced it, she replied. That is why, he said, I especially love the poets. I think verse more tender than prose, and that it moves far more easily to tears. Still in the long run it is tiring, continued Emma. Now on the contrary, adore stories that rush breathlessly along, that frighten one. I detest commonplace heroes and moderate sentiments, such as there are in nature. In fact, observed the clerk, these works, not touching the heart, miss, it seems to me, the true end of art. It is so sweet, amid all the disenchantments of life, to be able to dwell in thought upon noble characters, pure affections, and pictures of happiness. For myself, living here far from the world, this is my one distraction, but Yonville offers so few resources. Like Joe's, no doubt, replied Emma, and so I always subscribe to a lending library. If Madame will do me the honor of making use of it, said a chemist, who had just caught the last words, I have at her disposal a library composed of the best authors, Voltaire, Rousseau, Delille, Walter Scott, the Echo des Feuilletons, and in addition I receive various periodicals, among them the Finale des Rouen Daily, having the advantage to be its correspondent for the districts of Bouchy, Forges, Neufchâtel, Yonville, and vicinity. For 2 hours and a half they had been at table, for the servant, Artemis, carelessly dragging her old lace slippers over the flags, brought one plate after the other, forgot everything, and constantly left the door of the billiard room half open, so that it beat against the wall with its hooks. Unconsciously Leon, while talking, had placed his foot on one of the bars of the chair on which Madame Bovary was sitting. She wore a small blue silk necktie that kept up like a rough coiffured cambric collar, and with the movements of her head the lower part of her face gently sunk into the linen or came out from it. Thus side by side, while Charles and the chemist chatted, they entered into one of those vague conversations where the hazard of all that is said brings you back to the fixed center of a common sympathy. The Paris theaters, titles of novels, new quadrilles, and the world they did not know, Jos, where she had lived, Emunville, where they were, they examined all, talked of everything till to the end of dinner. When coffee was served, Félicite went away to get ready the room in the new house, and the guests soon raised the siege. Madame Lefrancois was asleep near the cinders, while the stable boy, lantern in hand, was waiting to show Monsieur and Madame Bovary the way home. Bits of straw stuck in his red hair, and he limped with his left leg. When he had taken in his other hand the cure's umbrella, they started. The town was asleep, the pillars of the market threw great shadows, the earth was all grey as on a summer's night. But as the doctor's house was only some 50 paces from the inn, they had to say good night almost immediately, and the company dispersed. As soon as she entered the passage, Emma felt the cold of the plaster fall about her shoulders like damp linen. The walls were new and the wooden stairs creaked. In their bedroom, on the first floor, a whitish light passed through the curtainless windows. She could catch glimpses of treetops, and beyond, the fields, half drowned in the fog that lay reeking in the moonlight along the course of the river. In the middle of the room, pell-mell, were scattered drawers, bottles, curtain rods, gilt bowls, with mattresses. On the chairs and basins on the ground, the two men who had brought the furniture had left everything about carelessly. This was the 4th time that she had slept in a strange place. The first was the day of her going to the convent, the second, of her arrival at Jos, the third, at Vaubyessard, and this was the fourth. And each one had marked, as it were, the inauguration of a new phase in her life. She did not believe that things could present themselves in the same way in different places, and since the portion of her life lived had been bad, no doubt that which remained should be lived would be better. Chapter 3. The next day, as she was getting up, she saw the clerk on the place. She had on a dressing gown. He looked up and bowed. She nodded quickly and reclosed the window. Leon waited all day for 6 o'clock in the evening to come, but on going to the inn, he found no one but Monsieur Bennet already at table. The dinner of the evening before had been a considerable event for him. He had never till then talked for 2 hours consecutively to a lady. How, then, had he been able to explain, and in such language, the number of things that he could not have said so well before? He was usually shy, and maintained that reserve which partakes at once of modesty and dissimulation. At Yonville he was considered well-bred. He listened to the arguments of the older people, and did not seem hot about politics, a remarkable thing for a young man. Then he had some accomplishments. He painted in watercolors, could read the key of G, and readily talked literature. After dinner, when he did not play cards, Monsieur Hamai respected him for his education, Madame Hamai liked him for his good nature, for he often took the little Hamai into the garden, little brats who were always dirty, very much spoilt, and somewhat lymphatic, like their mother. Besides the servant to look after them, they had Justin, the chemist's apprentice, a second cousin of Monsieur Hamai, who had been taken into the house from charity, and who was useful at the same time as a servant. The druggist proved the best of neighbors. He gave Madame Bovary information as to the tradespeople, sent expressly for his own cider. Merchant tasted the drink himself, and saw that the casks were properly placed in the cellar. He explained how to set about getting in a supply of butter cheap, and made an arrangement with Lestiboudoy, the sacristan, who, besides his sacerdotal and funeral functions, looked after the principal gardens at Yonville by the hour or the year, according to the taste of the customers. The need of looking after others was not the only thing that urged the chemist to such obsequious cordiality. There was a plan underneath it all. He had infringed the law of the 19th Fenchos, year 11, Article I, which forbade all persons not having a diploma to practice medicine, so that, after certain anonymous denunciations, Hamai had been summoned to Rouen to see the procureur of the king in his own private room. The magistrate, receiving him standing up, ermine on shoulder and cap on head. It was in the morning, before the court opened. In the corridors one heard the heavy boots of the gendarmes walking fast, and like a far-off noise, great locks that were shut. The druggist's ears tingled as if he were about to have an apoplectic stroke. He saw the depths of dungeons, his family in tears, his shop sold, all the jars dispersed, and he was obliged to enter a cafe and take a glass of rum and seltzer to recover his spirits. Little by little the memory of this reprimand grew fainter, and he continued, as heretofore, to give anodyne consultations in his back parlor. But the mayor resented it, his colleagues were jealous, everything was to be feared. Gaining over Monsieur Bovary by his attentions was to earn his gratitude and prevent his speaking out later on should he notice anything. So every morning Hamai brought him the paper, and often in the afternoon left his shop for a few moments to have a chat with the doctor. Charles was dull. Patients did not come. He remained seated for hours without speaking, went into his consulting room to sleep or watched his wife sewing. Then for diversion he employed himself at home as a workman. He even tried to do up the attic with some paint which had been left behind by the painters. But money matters worried him. He had spent so much for repairs at Joe's, for Madame's toilet and for the moving, that the whole dowry, over 3,000 crowns, had slipped away in 2 years. Then how many things had been spoiled or lost during their carriage from Toast to Yonville, without counting the plaster cure who, falling out of the coach at an over-severe jolt, had been dashed into 1,000 fragments on the pavements of Quincampoix. A pleasanter trouble came to distract him, namely, the pregnancy of his wife. As the time of her confinement approached, he cherished her the more. It was another bond of the flesh establishing itself, and as it were, a continued sentiment of a more complex union. When from afar he saw her languid walk, and her figure without stays turning softly on her hips, when opposite one another he looked at her at his ease, while she took tired poses in her armchair, then his happiness knew no bounds. He got up, embraced her, passed his hands over her face, called her little mama, wanted to make her dance, and half laughing, half crying, uttered all kinds of caressing pleasantries that came into his head. The idea of having begotten a child delighted him. Now he wanted nothing. He knew human life from end to end, and he sat down to it with serenity. Emma at first felt a great astonishment, then was anxious to be delivered that she might know what it was to be a mother, but not being able to spend as much as she would have liked to have a swing bassinet with rose silk curtains and embroidered caps. In a fit of bitterness she gave up looking after the trousseau and ordered the whole of it from a village needlewoman, without choosing or discussing anything. Thus she did not amuse herself with those preparations that stimulate the tenderness of mothers, and so her affection was from the very outset, perhaps, to some extent attenuated. As Charles, however, spoke of the boy at every meal, she soon began to think of him more consecutively. She hoped for a son. He would be strong and dark. She would call him George, and this idea of having a male child was like an expected revenge for all her impotence in the past. A man, at least, is free. He may travel over passions and over countries, overcome obstacles, taste of the most far-away pleasures. But a woman is always hampered. At once inert and flexible, she has against her the weakness of the flesh and legal dependence. Her will, like the veil of her bonnet, held by a string, flutters in every wind. There is always some desire that draws her, some conventionality that restrains. She was confined on a Sunday at about 6 o'clock, as the sun was rising. "It is a girl," said Charles. She turned her head away and fainted. Madame Hamai, as well as Madame Lafrancois of the Lion d'Or, almost immediately came running in to embrace her. The chemist, as man of discretion, only offered a few provincial felicitations through the half-open door. He wished to see the child and thought it well made. Whilst she was getting well, she occupied herself much in seeking a name for her daughter. First she went over all those that have Italian endings, such as Clara, Louisa, Amanda, Atola. She liked Golswind pretty well, and Isolde or Leocadie still better. Charles wanted the child to be called after her mother. Emma opposed this. They ran over the calendar from end to end, and then consulted outsiders. "Monsieur Léon," said a chemist, with whom I was talking about it the other day, "wonders you do not choose Madeleine. It is very much in fashion just now." But Madame Bovary, senior, cried out loudly against this name of a sinner. As to Monsieur Hamai, he had a preference for all those that recalled some great man, an illustrious fact or a generous idea, and it was on this system that he had baptized his 4 children. Thus Napoleon represented glory and Franklin liberty. Irma was perhaps a concession to romanticism, but Athalie was a homage to the greatest masterpiece of the French stage. For his philosophical convictions did not interfere With his artistic tastes, in him the thinker did not stifle the man of sentiment. He could make distinctions, make allowances for imagination and fanaticism. In this tragedy, for example, he found fault with the ideas but admired the style, he detested the conception but applauded all the details and loathed the characters, while he grew enthusiastic over their dialogue. When he read the fine passages he was transported, but when he thought that mummers would get something out of them for their show, he was disconsolate, and in this confusion of sentiments in which he was involved he would have liked at once to crown Racine with both his hands and discuss with him for a good quarter of an hour. At last Emma remembered that at the chateau of Vaubyessard she had heard the Marchioness call a young lady Berthe. From that moment this name was chosen, and as old Raoul could not come, Monsieur Hamai was requested to stand godfather. His gifts were all products from his establishment, to wit, 6 boxes of jujubes, a whole jar of racahout, 3 cakes of marshmallow paste, and 6 sticks of sugar candy into the bargain that he had come across in a cupboard. On the evening of the ceremony there was a grand dinner, the cure was present, there was much excitement. Monsieur Hamai towards liquor time began singing, Les Dieux des Bons Gens. Monsieur Léon sang a barcarolle, and Madame Bovary, Senior, who was godmother, a romance of the time of the Empire. Finally, Bovary, Senior, insisted on having the child brought down, and began baptizing it with a glass of champagne that he poured over its head. This mockery of the first of the sacraments made the Abbé Bornzian angry. Old Bovary replied by a quotation from Le Guerre des Dieux. The cure wanted to leave, the ladies implored, him interfered, and they succeeded in making the priest sit down again, and he quietly went on with the half-finished coffee in his saucer. Monsieur Bovary, Senior, stayed at Yonville a month, dazzling the natives by a superb policeman's cap with silver tassels that he wore in the morning when he smoked his pipe in the square. Being also in the habit of drinking a good deal of brandy, he often sent the servant to the Lion d'Or to buy him a bottle, which was put down to his son's account, and to perfume his handkerchiefs he used up his daughter-in-law's whole supply of eau de cologne. The latter did not at all dislike his company. He had knocked about the world, he talked about Berlin, Vienna, and Strasbourg, of his soldier times, of the mistresses he had had, the grand luncheons of which he had partaken. Then he was amiable, and sometimes even, either on the stairs or in the garden, would seize hold of her waist, crying, "Charles, look out for yourself." Then Madame Bovary, Senior, became alarmed for her son's happiness, and, fearing that her husband might in the long run have an immoral influence upon the ideas of the young woman, took care to hurry their departure. Perhaps she had more serious reasons for uneasiness. Monsieur Bovary was not the man to respect anything. One day Emma was suddenly seized with the desire to see her little girl, who had been put to nurse with the carpenter's wife, and, without looking at the calendar to see whether the 6 weeks of the Virgin were yet past, she set out for the Roulette's house, situated at the extreme end of the village, between the high road and the fields. It was midday, the shutters of the houses were closed, and the slate roofs that glittered beneath the fierce light of the blue sky seemed to strike sparks from the crest of the gables. A heavy wind was blowing. Emma felt weak as she walked. The stones of the pavement hurt her. She was doubtful whether she would not go home again, or go in somewhere to rest. At this moment Monsieur Léon came out from the neighboring door with a bundle of papers under his arm. He came to greet her, and stood in the shade in front of the Leroux's shop under the projecting grey awning. Madame Bovary said she was going to see her baby, but that she was beginning to grow tired. "If dash," said Léon, not daring to go on. "Have you any business to attend to?" she asked. And on the clerk's answer, she begged him to accompany her that same evening this was known in Yonville, and Madame Tuvatch, the mayor's wife, declared in the presence of her servant that Madame Bovary was compromising herself. To get to the nurses it was necessary to turn to the left on leaving the street, as if making for the cemetery, and to follow between little houses and yards a small path bordered with privet hedges. They were in bloom, and so were the speedwells, eglantines, thistles, and the sweet briar that sprang up from the thickets. Through openings in the hedges one could see into the huts some pigs on a dung heap or tethered cows rubbing their horns against the trunk of trees. The two, side by side, walked slowly, she leaning upon him, and he restraining his pace, which he regulated by hers. In front of them a swarm of midges fluttered, buzzing in the warm air. They recognized the house by an old walnut tree which shaded it. Low and covered with brown tiles, there hung outside it, beneath the dormer window of the garret, a string of onions, faggots upright against a thorn fence surrounded a bed of lettuce, a few square feet of lavender, and sweet peas strung on sticks. Dirty water was running here and there on the grass, and all round were several indefinite rags, knitted stockings, a red calico jacket, and a large sheet of coarse linen spread over the hedge. At the noise of the gate the nurse appeared, with a baby she was suckling on one arm. With her other hand she was pulling along a poor puny little fellow, his face covered with scrofula, the son of a ruined hosier, whom his parents, too taken up with their business, left in the country. "Go in," she said. "Your little one is there asleep." The room on the ground floor, the only one in the dwelling, had at its farther end, against the wall, a large bed without curtains, while a knitting trough took up the side by the window, one pane of which was mended with a piece of blue paper. In the corner behind the door, shining hobnailed shoes stood in a row under the slab of the washstand, near a bottle of oil with a feather stuck in its mouth. A Matthew Lensberg lay on the dusty mantelpiece amid gunflints, candlends, and bits of amadou. Finally, the last luxury in the apartment was a fame, blowing her trumpets, a picture cut out, no doubt, from some perfumer's prospectus, and nailed to the wall with 6 wooden shoe pegs. Emma's child was asleep in a wicker cradle. She took it up in the wrapping that enveloped it and began singing softly as she rocked herself to and fro. Leon walked up and down the room. It seemed strange to him to see this beautiful woman in her nankeen dress in the midst of all this poverty. Madame Bovary reddened. He turned away, thinking perhaps there had been an impertinent look in his eyes. Then she pulled back the little girl, who had just been sick, over her collar. The nurse at once came to dry her, protesting that it wouldn't show. "She gives me other doses," she said. "I am always a washing of her. If you would have the goodness to order Camus, the grocer, to let me have a little soap, it would really be more convenient for you, as I needn't trouble you then." Very well, said Emma. "Good morning, Madame Roulette," and she went out, wiping her shoes at the door. The good woman accompanied her to the end of the garden, talking all the time of the trouble she had getting up of nights. "I'm that worn out sometimes as I drop asleep on my chair. I'm sure you might at least give me just a pound of ground coffee, that'd last me a month, and I'd take it of a morning with some milk." After having submitted to her thanks, Madame Bovary left. She had gone a little way down the path when, at the sound of wooden shoes, she turned round. It was the nurse. "What is it?" Then the peasant woman, taking her aside behind an elm tree, began talking to her of her husband, who with his trade and 6 francs a year, that the captain dash. "Oh, be quick," said Emma. "Well," the nurse went on, heaving sighs between each word, "I'm afraid he'll be put out seeing me have coffee alone, you know, Mendash." "But you are to have some," Emma repeated. "I will give you some. You bother me." dear. My poor dear lady. You see, in consequence of his wounds he has terrible cramps in the chest. He even says that cider weakens him. Do make haste, Mirolette." "Well," the latter continued, making a curtsy, "if it weren't asking too much," and she curtsied once more, "if you would dash in her eyes, beg dash a jar of brandy," she said at last, "and I'd rub your little one's feet with it, they're as tender as one's tongue." Once rid of the nurse, Emma again took Monsieur Leon's arm. She walked fast for some time, then more slowly, and looking straight in front of her eyes rested on the shoulder of the young man, whose frock coat had a black velvety collar. His brown hair fell over it, straight and carefully arranged. She noticed his nails, which were longer than one wore them at Yonville. It was one of the clerk's chief occupations to trim them, and for this purpose he kept a special knife in his writing desk. They returned to Yonville by the waterside. In the warm season the bank, wider than at other times, showed to their foot the garden walls, whence a few steps led to the river. It flowed noiselessly, swift, and cold to the eye. Long, thin grasses huddled together in it as the current drove them, and spread themselves upon the limpid water like streaming hair. Sometimes at the tip of the reeds or on the leaf of a water lily an insect with fine legs crawled or rested. The sun pierced with a ray the small blue bubbles of the waves that, breaking, followed each other. Branchless old willows mirrored their grey backs in the water. Beyond, all around, the meadows seemed empty. It was the dinner hour at the farms, and the young woman and her companion heard nothing as they walked but the fall of their steps on the earth of the bath, the words they spoke, and the sound of Emma's dress rustling round her. The walls of the gardens with pieces of bottle on their coping were hot as the glass windows of a conservatory. Wallflowers had sprung up between the bricks, and with the tip of her open sunshade Madame Bovary, as she passed, made some of their faded flowers crumble into a yellow dust, or a spray of overhanging honeysuckle and clematis got in its fringe and dangled for a moment over the silk. They were talking of a troupe of Spanish dancers who were expected shortly at the Rouen Theatre. "Are you going?" she asked. "If I can," he answered. Had they nothing else to say to one another? Yet their eyes were full of more serious speech, and while they forced themselves to find trivial phrases, they felt the same languor stealing over them both. It was the whisper of the soul, deep, continuous, dominating that of their voices. Surprised with wonder at this strange sweetness, they did not think of speaking of the sensation or of seeking its cause. Coming joys, like tropical showers, throw over the immensity before them their inborn softness, an odorous wind, and we are lulled by this intoxication, without a thought of the horizon that we do not even know. In one place the ground had been trodden down by the cattle. They had to step on large green stones put here and there in the mud. She often stopped a moment to look where to place her foot, and, tottering on a stone that shook, her arms outspread, her form bent forward with a look of indecision, she would laugh, afraid of falling into the puddles of water. When they arrived in front of her garden, Madame Bovary opened the little gate, ran up the steps and disappeared. Leon returned to his office. His chief was away. He just glanced at the briefs, then cut himself a pen, and at last took up his hat and went out. He went to Le Patcher at the top of the Argyll Hills at the beginning of the forest. He threw himself upon the ground under the pines and watched the sky through his fingers. "How bored I am," he said to himself. "How bored I am." He thought he was to be pitied for living in this village with Hamae for a friend and Monsieur Hugues for master. The latter, entirely absorbed by his business, wearing gold-rimmed spectacles and red whiskers over a white cravat, understood nothing of mental refinements, although he affected a stiff English manner, which in the beginning had impressed the clerk. As to the chemist's spouse, she was the best wife in Normandy, gentle as a sheep, loving her children, her father, her mother, her cousins, weeping for others' woes, letting everything go in her household, and detesting corsets, but so slow of movement, such a bore to listen to, so common in appearance, and of such restricted conversation, that although she was 30, he only 20, although they slept in rooms next each other and he spoke to her daily, he never thought that she might be a woman for another, or that she possessed anything else of her sex than the gown. And what else was there? Benet, a few shopkeepers, 2 or 3 publicans, the curé, and finally Monsieur Duvac the mayor, with his 2 sons, rich, crabbed, obtuse persons, who farmed their own lands, and had feasts among themselves, bigoted to boot, and quite unbearable companions. But from the general background of all these human faces Emma stood out, isolated and yet farthest off, for between her and him he seemed to see a vague abyss. In the beginning he had called on her several times along with the druggist. Charles had not appeared particularly anxious to see him again, and Leon did not know what to do between his fear of being indiscreet and the desire for an intimacy that seemed almost impossible. Chapter 4. When the first cold days set in, Emma left her bedroom for the sitting room, a long apartment with a low ceiling, in which there was on the mantelpiece a large bunch of coral spread out against the looking-glass. Seated in her armchair near the window, she could see the villagers pass along the pavement. Twice a day Leon went from his office to the Lion d'Or. Emma could hear him coming from afar. She leant forward listening, and the young man glided past the curtain, always dressed in the same way and without turning his head. But in the twilight, when, her chin resting on her left hand, she let the embroidery she had begun fall on her knees, she often shuddered at the apparition of this shadow suddenly gliding past. She would get up and order the table to be laid. Monsieur Humai called at dinner time. Skullcap in hand, he came in on tiptoe, in order to disturb no one, always repeating the same phrase, "Good evening, everybody." Then, when he had taken his seat at the table between the pair, he asked the doctor about his patients, and the latter consulted his as to the probability of their payment. Next they talked of what was in the paper. Humai by this hour knew it almost by heart, and he repeated it from end to end, with the reflections of the penny-a-liners, and all the stories of individual catastrophes that had occurred in France or abroad. But, the subject becoming exhausted, he was not slow in throwing out some remarks on the dishes before him. Sometimes even, half rising, he delicately pointed out to Madame the tenderest morsel, or turning to the servant, gave her some advice on the manipulation of stews and the hygiene of seasoning. He talked aroma, osmosome, juices, and gelatine in a bewildering manner. Moreover, Humai, with his head fuller of recipes than his shop of jars, excelled in making all kinds of preserves, vinegars, and sweet liquors. He knew also all the latest inventions in economic stoves, together with the art of preserving cheese and of curing sick wines. At 8 o'clock Justin came to fetch him to shut up the shop. Then Monsieur Humai gave him a sly look, especially if Felicite was there, for he had noticed that his apprentice was fond of the doctor's house. "The young dog," he said, "is beginning to have ideas, and the devil take me if I don't believe he's in love with your servant." But a more serious fault with which he reproached Justine was his constantly listening to conversation. On Sunday, for example, one could not get him out of the drawing-room, whither Madame Humai had called him to fetch the children, who were falling asleep in the armchairs and dragging down with their backs calico chair covers that were too large. Not many people came to these soirees at the chemist's, his scandal-mongering and political opinions having successfully alienated various respectable persons from him. The clerk never failed to be there. As soon as he heard the bell he ran to meet Madame Bovary, took her shawl, and put away under the shop counter the thick list shoes that she wore over her boots when there was snow. First they played some hands at 20 a ton, next Monsieur Hamaille played a card with Emma. Leon behind her gave her advice. Standing up with his hands on the back of her chair he saw the teeth of her comb that bit into her chignon. With every movement that she made to throw her cards the right side of her dress was drawn up. From her turned-up hair a dark color fell over her back, and growing gradually, pallor lost itself little by little in the shade. Then her dress fell on both sides of her chair, buffing out full of folds, and reached the ground. When Leon occasionally felt the sole of his boot resting on it, he drew back as if he had trodden upon someone. When the game of cards was over, the druggist and the doctor played dominoes, and Emma, changing her place, leant her elbow on the table, turning over the leaves of illustration. She had brought her lady's journal with her. Leon sat down near her. They looked at the engravings together, and waited for one another at the bottom of the pages. She often begged him to read her the verses. Leon declaimed them in a languid voice, to which he carefully gave a dying fall in the love passages. But the noise of the dominoes annoyed him. Monsieur Hamaille was strong at the game. He could beat Charles and give him a double six. Then the 300 finished. They both stretched themselves out in front of the fire, and were soon asleep. The fire was dying out in the cinders. The teapot was empty. Leon was still reading. Emma listened to him, mechanically turning around the lampshade, on the gauze of which were painted clowns and carriages, and tightrope dances, with their balancing poles. Leon stopped, pointing with a gesture to his sleeping audience. Then they talked in low tones, and their conversation seemed the more sweet to them because it was unheard. Thus a kind of bond was established between them, a constant commerce of books and of romances. Monsieur Bovary, little given to jealousy, did not trouble himself about it. On his birthday he received a beautiful phrenological head, all marked with figures to the thorax and painted blue. This was an attention of the clerk's. He showed him many others, even to doing errands for him at Rouen, and the book of a novelist having made the mania for cactuses fashionable. Leon bought some for Madame Bovary, bringing them back on his knees in the hirondelle, pricking his fingers on their hard hairs. She had a board with a balustrade fixed against her window to hold the pots. The clerk, too, had his small hanging garden. They saw each other tending their flowers at their windows. Of the windows of the village there was one yet more often occupied, for on Sundays from morning to night, and every morning when the weather was bright, one could see at the dormer window of the garret the profile of Monsieur Bnet bending over his lathe, whose monotonous humming could be heard at the Lion d'Or. One evening on coming home Leon found in his room a rug in velvet and wool with leaves on a pale ground. He called Madame Hamaille, Monsieur Hamaille, Justin, the children, the cook. He spoke of it to his chief. Everyone wanted to see this rug. Why did the doctor's wife give the clerk presents? It looked queer. They decided that she must be his lover. He made this seem likely, so ceaselessly did he talk of her charms and of her wit, so much so that Bnet once roughly answered him, "What does it matter to me since I'm not in her set?" He tortured himself to find out how he could make his declaration to her, and always halting between the fear of displeasing her and the shame of being such a coward, he wept with discouragement and desire. Then he took energetic resolutions, wrote letters that he tore up, put it off to times that he again deferred. Often he set out with the determination to dare all, but this resolution soon deserted him in Emma's presence, and when Charles, dropping in, invited him to jump into his chaise to go with him to see some patient, In the neighborhood, he at once accepted, bowed to Madame, and went out. Her husband, was he not something belonging to her? As to Emma, she did not ask herself whether she loved. Love, she thought, must come suddenly, with great outbursts and lightnings, a hurricane of the skies, which falls upon life, revolutionizes it, roots up the will like a leaf and sweeps the whole heart into the abyss. She did not know that on the terrace of houses it makes lakes when the pipes are choked, and she would thus have remained in her security when she suddenly discovered a rent in the wall of it. Chapter 5. It was a Sunday in February, an afternoon when the snow was falling. They had all, Monsieur and Madame Bovary, and Monsieur Léon, gone to see a yarn mill that was being built in the valley a mile and a half from Yonville. The druggist had taken Napoleon and Athalie to give them some exercise, and Justine accompanied them, carrying the umbrellas on his shoulder. Nothing, however, could be less curious than this curiosity. A great piece of waste ground on which pell-mell, amid a mass of sand and stones, were a few brake wheels, already rusty, surrounded by a quadrangular building pierced by a number of little windows. The building was unfinished. The sky could be seen through the joists of the roofing. Attached